Today we will be discussing the causes and effects of the Vietnam War. Vietnam had been under French colonial rule since the 19th century. During World War II, Japanese forces invaded Vietnam. To fight off both Japanese occupiers and the French colonial administration, political leader Ho Chi Minh formed the League of the Independence for Vietnam. Following its 1945 defeat in World War II, Japan withdrew its forces from Vietnam, leaving the French-educated Emperor Bao Dai in control. Seeing an opportunity to seize control, Ho's Viet Minh forces immediately rose up, taking over the northern city of Hanoi and declaring a Democratic Republic of Vietnam with Ho as president. Seeking to regain control of the region, France backed Bao and set up the state of Vietnam in July of 1949. Both sides wanted the same thing, a unified Vietnam. But while Ho and his supporters wanted a nation modeled after other communist countries, Bao and many others wanted a Vietnam with close economic and cultural ties to the West. The Vietnam War and active U.S. involvement in the war began in 1954, though ongoing conflict in the region had stretched back to several decades. After Ho's communist forces took power in the north, armed conflict between northern and southern armies continued until a decisive battle of Bien Dinh Phu in the May of 1954 ended the victory for northern Vietnam Minh forces. The French loss at the battle ended almost a century of French colonial rule in Indochina. The subsequent treaty signed in July of 1954 at the Geneva Conference split Vietnam along the 17th parallel, with Ho in control in the north and Bao in the south. With the Cold War intensifying worldwide, the United States hardened its policies against any allies of the Soviet Union, and by 1955, President Dwight D. Eisenhower had pledged his firm support to Diem in South Vietnam. A team sent by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 to report on conditions in South Vietnam advised a buildup of American military, economic and technical aid in order to help Diem confront the Viet Cong threat. Working under the domino theory, which held what if one southern East Asian country fell to communism, many other countries would follow. Kennedy increased U.S. aid, though he stopped short of committing to a large-scale military intervention. By 1962, the U.S. military presence in South Vietnam had reached to 9,000 troops, compared to fewer than 800 during the 1950s. In August of 1964, before DRV torpedo boats attacked two U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, Johnson ordered the retaliatory bombing of military targets in North Vietnam. Congress soon passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave Johnson broad war-making powers. In March of 1965, Johnson made the decision to send U.S. combat forces into battle with Vietnam. By June, 82,000 combat troops were stationed in Vietnam, and military leaders were calling for 175,000 more by the end of 1965. By November 1967, the number of American troops in Vietnam was approaching 500,000, and U.S. casualties had reached to about 15,000 kills and 109,000 wounded. As the war stretched on, some soldiers came to mistrust the government's reasons for keeping them there, as well as Washington's repeated claims that the war had been won. The later years of the war saw increasing physical and psychological deterioration among American soldiers, including drug use, PTSD, and etc. Between July 1966 and December of 1973, more than 503,000 U.S. military personnel deserted, and an anti-war movement among American forces spawned violent protests, killings, and mass incarcerations of personnel stationed in Vietnam as well as within the United States. On January 31st of 1968, 17,000 DRV forces launched the Tet Offense, a coordinated series of fierce attacks on more than 100 cities in the South Vietnam. Taken by surprise, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces managed to strike back quickly, and the Communists were unable to hold any of the targets for more than a day or two. Nixon sought to deflate the anti-war movements by appealing to a silent majority of Americans who believed supported the war effort. In an attempt to limit the volume of American casualties, he announced a program called the Vietnamization, which means withdrawing U.S. troops, increasing aerial and artillery bombardment, and giving the South Vietnamese the trading weapons needed to effectively control the ground war. The next few years would bring even more carnage, including the horrifying revelation that U.S. soldiers had mercilessly slaughtered more than 400 unarmed civilians in the village of My Lai in March of 1968. After the My Lai massacre, anti-war protesters continued to build as the conflict wore on. In 1968 and in 1969, there were hundreds of protest marches and gatherings throughout the country. On November 15, 1969, the largest anti-war demonstration in American history took place in Washington, D.C., as over 250,000 Americans gathered peacefully, calling for a withdrawal of American troops in Vietnam. As the first U.S. troops were withdrawn, those who remained became increasingly angry and frustrated. Tens of thousands of soldiers received dishonorable discharges for desertion, and about 500,000 American men from 1965 to 73 became draft dodgers, with many fleeing to Canada to evade conscription. Nixon ended draft calls in 1972 and instituted an all-volunteer army the following year. When did the Vietnam War end? In January of 1973, the United States and North Vietnam concluding a final peace agreement ending open hostilities between the two nations. War between the North and South Vietnam continued until April 30th, 1975, when DRV forces captured Saigon, renaming it Ho Chi Minh City. More than 2 decades of violent conflicts had influenced a devastating toll on Vietnamese population. After years of warfare, an estimated 2 million Vietnamese were killed, while 3 million were wounded and another 12 million became refugees. Warfare had demolished the country's infrastructure and economy, and reconstruction proceeded slowly. In the United States, the effects of the Vietnam War would linger long after the last troops returned home in 1973. The nation spent more than $120 billion on the conflict in Vietnam from 1965 to 1973. This massive spending led to a widespread inflation, exacerbated by a worldwide oil crisis in 1973 and skyrocketing fuel prices.